All right, I think we're ready to get started. This is the order from the program that we have. Jan Engelmann is going to present first, and then Marjorie Rhodes, and then me, and then Gweon will go last, and each of us will have time for questions in the middle, and Erica is going to moderate questions. All right, so let's get started. Thank you for being here in person or wherever you are.
Well, hi everyone from Berlin. Hi Mike, congratulations on the prize. Maybe could anyone just tell me whether you can hear me well? Or maybe, yeah, just let me know if you can't hear me well. Okay, I see a message in the chat. Okay, great, all good. So I want to do two things today. In the first part, I will review two insights from Mike for the study of the evolution of cognition. And then in the second part of the talk, the main part, I will show how I've tried to apply these insights of Mike in my lab's recent investigation of the understanding of possibilities in chimpanzees. So, as many of you will surely know, Mike has been very interested throughout most of his career, I would say, in the evolution of animal cognition. And one of the main lessons or insights that Mike has developed about the evolution of cognition is that cognition is for action. So that, you know, cognition is not something that natural selection selects for independently of action, but natural selection always will select for cognition to the extent that it leads to adaptive action. So here's an example from Mike's 2011 book, A Natural History of Human Thinking, where Mike says, "It seems to us that many of the perplexities of human thinking pointed out by philosophers arise precisely when we attempt to understand it in the abstract, outside of its functioning in solving adaptive problems. But uniquely human thinking was almost certainly selected evolutionarily for its role in organizing and regulating adaptive actions. And so to understand it fully, we must identify the relevant problems." And you know, in one short sentence that I really like, in evolution, being smart counts for nothing if it does not lead to acting smart. So insight number one, from this evolutionary biological perspective, cognition has evolved for action. Now, the second insight that I want to talk about is an insight that is more specifically about chimpanzee cognition. And that insight or lesson is that in chimpanzees, the most advanced forms of cognition have evolved for competitive action. So of course, chimpanzees don't only use their cognition in competitive interactions, they also use it in cooperative interactions. But the idea here that Mike and colleagues put forward is that their most advanced skills of cognition will appear in competitive contexts. So again, here's a quotation from Mike from his 2011 book again. "Primate cognition of the social world evolved mainly in the context of competition within the social group for food, mates, and other valued resources. Competitive social interactions are thus its proper functions." And again, with one nice sentence, great apes are all about cognition for competition. And you know, this is not just sort of a theoretical perspective, but Mike has also put his own insights into practice. So I just want to give you one short example here that maybe many of you are familiar with, and that's an example from theory of mind research. So for a long time, people like Povinelli have argued that chimpanzees don't have a theory of mind. They don't understand, for example, that others have perceptual states. One famous study, for example, showed that chimpanzees would back indiscriminately from someone who has a bucket over their head compared to someone who has a bucket next to their head. But what Mike and colleagues found is that if you look at the exactly same capacity, theory of mind, in a competitive social interaction in chimpanzees, one that has naturalistic relevance. So for example, here a subordinate competing with a dominant for food, you will see that actually chimpanzees can very well take into consideration what others have and have not seen. So these were two insights from Mike, and now I'm going to talk about how we have tried to apply these insights in our recent investigations of understanding of possibilities in chimpanzees. Now, what I mean here by representing possibilities is this amazing human ability that we can represent not only what is the case, so actual events, but that we can also represent what could be the case or what could have been the case, so non-actual events. And many key operations of human cognition involve the representation of possibilities. So for example, in moral judgment, we judge those people more harshly that could have acted differently, that could have done the right thing. In future planning, we very explicitly represent possibilities. So if you're going on vacation, you might think it might rain, so I better bring rain gear, but the sun might also shine, so I'll better also bring shirts and shorts and so on. And finally, one of the dominant theories of causal reasoning holds that we identify causal variables by counterfactual reasoning. So in all of these cases, human cognition involves the representation of possibilities. Now, if you are like me interested in the representation of possibilities from an evolutionary perspective, the big question is, of course, how can you test, how can you investigate this quite advanced ability in nonverbal populations? And prior research has actually argued that there's a failure to represent possibilities in chimpanzees, or at least they have not found evidence for it. So this is, I think, the most influential study in this domain. It uses the so-called Y-shaped tube paradigm. This was first developed by Beck and colleagues and recently reinstated by Retshaw and Suddendorf. So the idea here is that the experimenter drops a piece of reward into an inverted Y-shaped tube, and there are two exits. And now if an organism is able to represent alternative possibilities, what they should do is this. They should cover both of the exits. And as you can see very nicely already in this picture, chimpanzees failed to represent alternative possibilities in this study. They always covered, or mostly covered, one of the exits. The problem with this study, I think, is that the behavior that this study tests for, so this kind of behavior, is not within chimpanzees' behavioral repertoire. So you can already see here in this study, chimpanzees in such tasks often use one hand to stabilize themselves, and then they use the other hand to participate in the task. And Megan Lambert and Matthias Oswald have also shown experimentally that this behavior is very difficult for chimpanzees. So even when you drop two pieces of rewards, chimpanzees rarely ever do this. So what we've tried to do here, we've tried to develop an experimental paradigm that is more suited for chimpanzees' behavioral repertoire, and that takes into considerations Mike's insights about the evolution of cognition. So before I get started, just one more piece of terminology. So we, of course, most often need to represent alternative possibilities in situations of uncertainty. And scholars like Sarah Beck and others have differentiated between two types of uncertainty. So physical uncertainty is uncertainty that resides in the external world. So it's often also called external uncertainty. So think here about a die that has not been thrown yet. You don't know what it will show. And you can contrast that with epistemic uncertainty, also often called internal uncertainty. So here the world has already been determined to be one way or another, but you don't have epistemic access to the world, so you are uncertain. And prior research by Beck and colleagues has shown that this variable is of psychological relevance. So for example, for young children, it's easier to specify alternative possibilities under physical than epistemic uncertainty. So what we tried to do in our studies is to apply Mike's insights and study both physical and epistemic uncertainty. And these are my collaborators for the study that I'm going to talk about: Christoph Wölter, Carlo Madigan, Marina Proft, Hannes Rakocci, and Esther Herrmann. And all of the studies that I'll be talking about were pre-registered. So here's our first study. What's very important here is we used a behavior that's within chimpanzees' behavioral repertoire. Namely, instead of holding your hands like this, pulling both ropes simultaneously. It's a behavior that has been shown by chimpanzees in many previous experiments. And then, as you can see, there are two opaque boxes here. And we had two conditions, an opaque condition and a transparent condition. And let me actually demonstrate what we did. So, I showed the chimpanzee an apple, then I hid the apple in my hands, and then I moved my hands to the two boxes and put the apple either into the left or the right box. Now, in the opaque condition, as you can see, the chimpanzees don't know where the apple is. In the transparent condition, they can see where the apple is located. We tested 6 chimpanzees in a within subjects ABBA design. Now, here's one example. This is Mwanzo, a chimpanzee at Sweetwater's Chimpanzee Sanctuary in Kenya. And this is the transparent condition, the control condition. I hope the video now is not too laggy. Okay, Mwanzo only pulled one rope, or one end of the rope. As you could see here, this is just one continuous rope, right? So if you pull one end of the rope, the other end of the rope becomes inaccessible. So, but this is the really interesting case here. Here's the opaque condition. So this is the first trial for Mwanzo. What will she do in this case where she doesn't know where the food is located? So here Mwanzo pulled both ropes, suggesting, or at least raising the possibility that Mwanzo represented that the food could either be in one box or in the other box. Here you can see the behavior of the 6 chimpanzees over the entire course of the experiment. And please pay particular attention to the green squares. So these are the trials on which chimpanzees pulled both ropes. And as you can immediately see, chimpanzees were much more likely to pull both ropes in the opaque condition than in the transparent conditions. And this was also revealed by our statistical analyses. We found a significant main effect of condition. And importantly, we found a non-significant interaction between condition and session. So this is important because it shows that in the second control session, chimpanzees stopped pulling both ropes. Now, I think that this first study provides some preliminary evidence that chimpanzees might actually be able to reason about alternative possibilities. But we, of course, wanted to replicate this finding with a different set of chimpanzees. And we also wanted to make the two conditions even more similar to one another. So notice that in our previous study that I just talked about, chimpanzees face 2 opaque boxes in the test condition, but 2 clear boxes in the control condition. So chimpanzees might just follow a simple heuristic, like if you see 2 opaque boxes, pull both boxes. So in our second study, we actually used opaque boxes in both conditions. But what we varied is I again hit the apple in exactly the same way, but now we had an observed and an unobserved condition. In the unobserved condition, chimpanzees could not see where I placed the apple. In the observed condition, I engaged in exactly the same type of behavior, but chimpanzees could see where I placed the apple. And we tested 9 chimpanzees, this time at Ngamba Island Chimpanzee Sanctuary in Uganda, again using a within subjects design. And just very briefly, here's a Sega in the observed condition. Pulling one rope, and here's Pasa in the unobserved condition. Pulling both ropes. And the pattern that we found here in study 2 is very similar to the pattern we found in the first study. Chimpanzees were more likely to pull both ropes in the test condition compared to the control condition. Although, as you can see here, the pattern was maybe not quite as obvious as in study 1. But again, we found a significant main effect of condition and this non-significant condition session interaction. So I think these two studies taken together present evidence that chimpanzees can specify alternative possibilities under epistemic uncertainty. And I think we've already incorporated some of Mike's lessons in these studies, some of Mike's insights. So for example, these are very action-oriented paradigms. The behaviors are within chimpanzees' behavioral repertoire. But notice that we haven't really incorporated Mike's insight about chimpanzees' cognition being adapted for competitive interactions yet. So that's what we tried to do in this last study that I'm going to talk about, where we wanted to investigate chimpanzees' understanding of possibilities under physical uncertainty. Okay, I have 5 more minutes. Thank you for the heads up. So what we tried to do here, again, as I just said, we tried to look at this capacity in a competitive interaction. We also used a Y-shaped tube. So we tried to keep this as similar as possible to the previous study, but we placed the whole situation in a competitive context. So this is what this looked like. Here you can see me. This is again at Ngamba Island Chimpanzee Sanctuary in Uganda. You can see me interacting with a chimpanzee. And in the Y-tube condition, we have a Y-tube. In the control condition, the single tube condition, we have a single tube. And what happened is that I placed 2 pieces of rewards on these platforms. So 1 piece of reward on each platform. And then I left the stage. And then a second experimenter appeared, and that experimenter was the competitor. So that experimenter dropped a piece of rock into the tube, and we had constructed these platforms in such a way that when the rock hit the platform would tilt, the food would fall to the ground, and the competitor would take the food away. Now, this is something that chimpanzees really don't like if you take food away from them. But chimpanzees learned that they could prevent the competitor from taking food away by stabilizing the platforms. So they could hold onto the platforms, and if they held onto the platform, they couldn't collapse, and the experimenter couldn't take away the food. I'll show you what this looks like in a second. We tested 15 chimpanzees in a within subjects design. So here this is Oketch, and please pay particular attention to Oketch's hands, because this is the dependent variable that we're interested in. So I'm placing the 2 rewards. So I hope you could I hope the internet was good enough that you could see that Oketch also showed this negative emotional reaction towards the experimenter. So our manipulation worked. The chimpanzee saw this as a competitive interaction. Here just a few other examples of what this looked like. Here's a chimpanzee who doesn't stabilize both platforms. And loses the food. And here's the control condition where we just had the single tube, so chimpanzees knew where the rock would drop. So here you see a box and dot plot showing the proportion of trials in which the chimpanzees stabilized both platforms across the 2 conditions. The dots represent individual mean values, and the lines connect values of the same individuals. And what you can see here is that 14 out of the 15 chimpanzees were more likely to stabilize both platforms in the Y-tube condition compared to the single tube condition. There was only 1 chimpanzee who didn't differentiate between the 2 conditions. So here, this is my last slide. So I presented to you today evidence that chimpanzees can represent possibilities both under epistemic and physical uncertainty. And taking Mike's insights or putting them into practice, I think these results also highlight the importance of using experimental paradigms that are appropriate for nonverbal animals, so that you use action-oriented, competitive contexts and behaviors that are within subjects' behavioral repertoire. So I think, yeah, this raises the intriguing possibility that chimpanzee thought is like human thought, not limited to what is, but also involves thinking about what could be the case, what could happen, maybe even what could have happened. So chimpanzees seem to be able to hold multiple possibilities in mind at once. Just at the very end, I want to point out, I didn't have time to talk about this study, but in another study, where we looked at logical reasoning, we found that chimpanzees do not seem to be able to represent possibilities, alternative possibilities in this task. And so I just want to end by highlighting that I think the ability to represent alternative possibilities is often considered as a single capacity in developmental and comparative psychology. But I think much more likely, it's not a capacity that you either have or that you don't have, but it's a capacity that is made up of many different components, and probably young children and chimpanzees have some of these components, but not all of these components. So one interesting example of this, I think, that we want to test in future work is whether it's easier for chimpanzees and young children to reason about multiple possible actions in which they could engage versus to reason about multiple possible states of the world. With this, I want to thank Mike very much. I want to thank all my collaborators, and thank you so much for listening.
All right, so we have a few minutes for questions. There's no questions yet on the virtual platform, but if anyone in this room wants to walk up to the microphone, Jan will be able to hear you.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. So I have a question about individual differences in these chimps, because we saw that on the graphs that you showed, it seemed like there were some individuals who had a lot of trouble with these tasks. And I'm curious as to why there is so much variability. And also, I'm not sure if the same individuals were tested in the physical uncertainty and the epistemic uncertainty tasks, but I was curious if there seemed to be a connection between the two, where the individuals who failed on the epistemic uncertainty also fail on the physical uncertainty, or if those seem like separate capacities.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. These are great questions. So first of all, so I would say, so here we had 15 chimpanzees, right? And 14 of them showed the predicted pattern. So I would say actually here there wasn't so much. There's variation, of course, in terms of how often they stabilized both platforms, but there's not so much variation in terms of whether chimpanzees passed the task or not. One thing that we have noticed, and it's of course always a little bit hard to talk about individual differences with the kind of sample sizes we have here, but one thing that we have noticed just sort of anecdotally is that so for example, one obvious difference here is that some chimpanzees seem to have stabilized both platforms very often, also in the control condition, whereas some chimpanzees didn't really do this. They were really good at just stabilizing one platform. And just anecdotally, what I can say is that it seems to have been those chimpanzees that are very, very sort of ambiguity averse, that are very uncertainty averse, as we have seen in previous studies. And it would, of course, be very, very interesting to test these correlations. We unfortunately only have 3 chimpanzees that participated in both epistemic and physical uncertainty, so we cannot really get at your second question. But maybe I can share one more anecdote from the first study that I found quite interesting. So again, here you actually see that actually all the chimpanzees except for Z here at the very beginning showed the expected pattern. They pulled both ropes more often in the opaque compared to the transparent condition. Now, what I found out when I watched the videos afterwards, what was happening in the Z case is that Z actually handled the uncertainty in a different way. So Z climbed up in his room in a way that I couldn't see. And from this vantage point, Z could actually see where I hit the apple. So Z kind of, tricked me there. And that's just to show that there may be also individual differences in terms of how chimpanzees deal with uncertainties.
Okay, I'm just going to give one more moment for people that are joining us virtually, if anyone has a question there. Right, I think we're ready to move on to our next speaker, Marjorie Rhodes.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, I can't see anyone, so let me know if there's a problem. Otherwise, oh, I'm getting a chat. All good. Okay, wonderful. All right, good morning, everybody. Congratulations to Mike on this very well-deserved honor. And I'm really delighted to speak in this symposium, which I think so nicely highlights how broadly and profoundly Mike's work has shaped the field. Okay. Mike's work has shown us the incredible power of human teaching and learning. Because people have such sophisticated social cognitive mechanisms for transferring knowledge across generations, no child has to start from scratch to do things like invent advanced mathematics or figure out how to play a violin. Children get a huge head start because people teach them and they can learn so well from other people. This means that children also do not start from scratch in inventing all of the problematic beliefs and behaviors that people do either. The same social cognitive abilities for communication that help children learn so many useful things so fast also mean that they will quickly pick up on the biased and problematic beliefs that people in their community hold as well. So today I'm going to share with you just a few examples of what I'll call this kind of social mislearning. My broader hope with this work is that by thinking in detail about the processes that underlie the transfer of problematic social beliefs across generations in a way that builds on and is inspired by Mike's discoveries, we can reveal what we would maybe need to do as people in the world, as parents and educators, if we wanted to block the continued transmission of problematic beliefs to children. So a powerful and dangerous set of beliefs that children often mislearn about the world include essentialist beliefs about social categories. Social essentialism entails the idea that some social categories reflect objective, fundamental, and stable distinctions that we discover rather than create in the world. People often hold these inaccurate representations of social categories like gender, race, ethnicity, language groups, religion, economic groups, and others. These beliefs are inaccurate and also problematic. For example, they deny the role of social construction in creating gender and racial disparities. They contribute to stereotyping and prejudice, and they foster support for social policies that intensify category boundaries and maintain rather than rectify category-based inequalities. These social essentialist beliefs arise early in development. So what I want to focus on today is how children learn this set of problematic and inaccurate beliefs from other people. Experimentally, my lab has looked at this issue by introducing children to a fictional group that at first glance looks pretty ad hoc and thrown together. So the characters here are diverse with respect to race, gender, and age. Each one is doing their own idiosyncratic behavior. We then look at what types of input or social experiences lead children to begin to develop essentialist beliefs about this group that they wouldn't hold otherwise. So this body of work has highlighted an important role of generic language in spreading essentialist beliefs across generations. To illustrate, I'll show you a video of a parent discussing this individual character from the group, who we call Zarpies, with their child. So the parent was given pictures of individual Zarpies, one at a time, with no text, and asked to discuss the pictures just as they would go through any picture book at home. So here's a mother and child discussing this picture. Let me know if there's any problem with the sound, please.
Oh my goodness. But sometimes Zarpi people, they get really scared of ladybugs. Orange, yeah, the backdrop is orange. And this person is saying, ah, a ladybug, what am I gonna do? I'm afraid. So Zarpi's people like to have fun, but when they see ladybugs, they get really scared.
So I want to highlight some of the things that the parent said. Remember, they're looking at just one Zarpi, but through her word choice, the parent is often taking the Zarpi as standing in for the category as a whole by saying things like, Zarpi people, they get scared of ladybugs. Zarpi people like to have fun. When they see ladybugs, they get scared. Rather than many other things that she could say, like, oh, look, she is scared of a ladybug. Okay, so nothing in this language directly communicates essentialist beliefs about Zarpis or about the feature of being scared of ladybugs. Nothing here says Zarpis are scared of ladybugs because they're born that way, consistent with an essentialist view, instead of maybe because they read stories where ladybugs are scary villains, for example. Nothing in there says someone either is a Zarpi or not, and this can never change. Nothing says that it's natural and objective to think of Zarpis as a kind that's distinct from other kinds of people. So there's nothing explicitly essentialist in any of these sentences. But even though there is nothing explicitly essentialist in here, we think these kinds of statements often have a role in spreading problematic and inaccurate essentialist beliefs about social categories to children anyway, because of how children interpret them in the context of communication. So I'm just going to briefly walk through why we think this might happen. So the parent says Zarpis are afraid of ladybugs. The first thing I want to highlight is that already by age 2.5, the child recognizes the generic Zarpis are afraid of ladybugs and knows that it refers to an abstract kind, that the speaker is not referring to an individual or subset. So all I'm noting here is that the linguistic ability to recognize the generic and understand it as referring to a kind is something that develops pretty early in childhood. So we add to that children often defer to experts in how to talk about categories. So they usually think that adults are right about how things are supposed to be categorized and how to use language to refer to categories. Meaning in this case that if a knowledgeable adult is referring to Zarpis as an abstract kind, the child can infer that the kind Zarpi really exists in some meaningful and coherent way in the world because the speaker is referring to it in that way. If it was just a meaningless collection of individuals, then the adult wouldn't be referring to it as a coherent kind. Finally, children also realize that adults choose their words intentionally and could have used different words. The parent could have said, this Zarpi is afraid, or she is afraid, or people are afraid, or some people, but chose to highlight category membership in this way. So it was likely trying to communicate that the kind is important in some distinct and relevant way. All this is to say that when children hear knowledgeable people refer to a category with generics, they might start to think the category reflects objective, distinct, even natural structure in the world, because they take the speaker's choice to use a generic as a signal that the speaker sees the category in that way. As it turns out, children are correct here, not about the status of social categories in the world, but about what the use of a generic signals about people's beliefs. Because adults are indeed more likely to use generics for categories in conversations with children when they themselves hold essentialist beliefs about those categories. Experimentally, this is just to illustrate a general pattern, we and others have found that when children are introduced to a new category like Zarpis through a series of generics, like Zarpis have striped hair, Zarpis hop over puddles, rather than matched specific descriptions like this Zarpi has striped hair, this Zarpi hops over puddles, they begin to develop more essentialist beliefs about the category than they would otherwise, meaning they're more likely to think that someone's born a Zarpi, it's not something they acquire throughout their lifetime. They're more likely to think whether someone is a Zarpi is stable over time, more likely to think Zarpis have other properties in common, even ones they haven't heard described with generics, more likely to appeal to something intrinsic to the category to explain why a Zarpi is doing what it is doing. So I've been describing a particular communicative social cognitive process for why generics have these effects on the beliefs of young children, which is what they signal about speakers' beliefs. Of course, you could imagine entirely different accounts that have a lot more to do with the content of generic claims and what they signal or communicate about the prevalence of shared features across different kinds. Also, of course, multiple processes could be at play here, but this communicative account makes several unique predictions about how and why generics do what they do. So first, this perspective suggests that children's interpretation of generics is going to depend on their beliefs about speaker knowledge and intention. And second, this perspective suggests that the linguistic form of the generic does have a unique role here, separate from just the feature information that it describes or implies. Because from this perspective, children's interpretation of the speaker's choice to refer to an abstract kind with the generic is an important part of what's going on. So I would like to briefly show you some of the empirical evidence in support of these particular predictions. The first project, led by my graduate student, Kelsey Modi, looks at how children's interpretation of generics considers speaker knowledge and intention. This project looks at what children think generics imply about groups that are left out of generic descriptions. To do this, we introduced children to two fictional groups of people, Zarpies and Gorps, and they heard a generic description about one group like this.
Here are some more Zarpies and Gorps. Look at this Zarpie. Zarpies are good at painting pictures. I'll move it here to remind you that Zarpies are good at painting pictures.
Okay. So children are then asked about other Zarpies and Gorps. Is this Zarpie good at painting pictures? To that, they should say yes, because they just heard Zarpies are good at painting pictures, which implies the feature is broadly shared across members of the category. So that's very straightforward. On the other hand, they haven't heard anything about Gorps. One possibility is they won't be sure if Gorps are good at this or not, because they haven't heard anything about them. Another possibility is that they realize the speaker could have said Zarpies and Gorps are good at painting pictures, or kids are good, or this kid is good, or many other things, but chose to say Zarpies are good. And given these other possibilities that the speaker could have said, was therefore purposefully leaving Gorps out. In this way, hearing Zarpies are good at painting pictures, children should reliably infer that Gorps are not. So that's what these data show here. The yellow line is children's inferences about the mentioned group. That just shows, yes, they think other Zarpies are good at painting pictures after they hear Zarpies are good at painting pictures, which is not too surprising. The green line shows that by about age 4.5, they also reliably infer no, Gorps are not good at painting pictures, even though they didn't hear anything about Gorps at all. Again, we think this happens via a pragmatic process, wherein children infer that the speaker intentionally excluded Gorps from the description of who is good at this. In a comparison condition, children heard just a bunch of specific descriptions. This Zarpie is good at painting pictures. And in that case, they did not make any reliable inferences about the status of Gorps. We also wanted to test more directly that these findings likely stem from children's reasoning about speaker intentions. So we ran a follow-up study where we manipulated information about speaker knowledge, whether the speaker knew a lot about Zarpies and Gorps or not. When children are explicitly told that the speaker is knowledgeable, we replicated the previous pattern, which makes sense because if someone knows a lot about Zarpies and Gorps, then says something like Zarpies are good at painting pictures, it's a reasonable inference that they are purposefully excluding Gorps. But when we told them the speaker didn't know much about Zarpies and Gorps at all and was just learning things about them, then children stopped making inferences about the left out group, which also makes sense because if someone doesn't know much about Gorps, then they probably weren't making an intentional choice to leave them out of their description of who is good at something. So those studies are an example of some of our work looking at how children's beliefs about speakers' mental states shape how they interpret generic claims. I next want to turn to some of the evidence that the linguistic form has a unique role in communicating essentialist beliefs, which is sometimes separable from the implications of the information that the generic conveys about particular features. To remind you, this part of the hypothesis comes from the idea that children begin to essentialize social categories that they hear described with generics because they interpret the use of a generic as a signal that the adult sees the category in that way. So one way we've examined this issue, which I'm not going to go into in detail today, but I'll point you to this paper, is by looking at the consequences of negated generics. So these are instances where one speaker says something generic about a category, like Zarpies have striped hair, but another knowledgeable speaker disagrees by saying something like, no, they don't. From exchanges like that, children don't end up learning anything about whether or which features are actually shared across Zarpies. But they do learn that two speakers view the category as coherent and meaningful enough to discuss it generically, even if they disagree about what actually characterizes the category. So there in this work, we found that witnessing conversations like this still leads children to view the category in more essentialist terms than they would otherwise, even though they don't actually learn which features are characteristic of the kind. Okay. Another way we've looked at this more recently is to test the extent to which generics still elicit essentialist representations of social categories, even when they explicitly communicate anti-essentialist, or at least not essentialist content. So here we found that generics lead to essentialism, even if they describe social mechanisms of transmission. And this project was led by one of my other graduate students, Josie Benitez. So you can remember that I mentioned that the sentence, "Zarpies are scared of ladybugs," doesn't convey any explicit information about why this is the case. So it's interesting that even so, children often infer from these sentences that something intrinsic to being a Zarpie, like being born a Zarpie, is responsible for determining whether someone is a category member and determining if they are scared of ladybugs and have other shared features. In this study, we looked at what happened when we provide explicit causal information about why Zarpies share the properties they do, but vary the type of information. So children were introduced to Zarpies one at a time and heard one of 4 descriptions of each Zarpie, which depended on between subjects conditions that followed this 2x2 design shown here. So participants either heard a generic, Zarpies have stripes in their hair, or the specific, this Zarpie has stripes in her hair. But they also heard a reason why, which was either something biological, because Zarpies are born that way, or something that referred to a cultural form of communication. Zarpies are taught how to paint stripes in their hair. Children were assigned to one of these 4 conditions and introduced to 16 Zarpies. So they heard 16 claims following one of these 4 types. We then measured their essentialist beliefs about Zarpies. As in prior work I showed you, hearing generic descriptions like Zarpies have striped hair led children to develop more essentialist beliefs about Zarpies than specific descriptions like this Zarpie has striped hair. Interestingly, we found no effect of the type of causal information that we gave to explain why Zarpies had these features in common. So if we look at the causal origin conditions separately, so here are people who were told about biological causes, Zarpies have striped hair because they're born with striped hair. And here are kids who are told about cultural causes, so Zarpies have striped hair because they're taught to paint stripes in their hair. You can see it does seem like the effects of generics was a bit stronger when the generics also communicated information about biological causes, which is sensible because then they're getting multiple signals that something might reflect intrinsic cause here. But nevertheless, we found a significant effect of linguistic form, both when children were told about biological causes and when they were told about cultural causes with no interaction. So even when children were told that category members share features because they're taught to share them, they still thought of the category in more essentialist terms, meaning they thought the categories were innately determined, stable, inflexible, and objective, even when they heard them described with generics that explained that those commonalities arose from social mechanisms. So again, we think this is the case because part of what generics do is communicate that someone knowledgeable thinks the categories are natural and objective kinds, and children pay attention to that signal, sometimes even when the content expressed by the generic sends a different message. Finally, and this last part will be very brief, I mentioned at the beginning that part of why I think this work is important is because maybe by understanding more about the processes by which essentialist beliefs are transferred across generations, this could provide some guidance on how they might be blocked. But for that to be the case, then these rather subtle features of language that I'm telling you about have to be powerful enough to really operate in children's lives, not only in the lab. That's a tall order because children, of course, receive much noisier input from many different speakers in much noisier environments in their daily lives. So we can't assume that because we see effects like these in the lab that they really matter in development at all. For that, we need converging natural language studies to see if that's the case. So we've also been looking at these issues in the context of parent-child conversations about gender. So here's an example We ask parents and children to discuss pictures that show individuals doing a variety of stereotypical and counter-stereotypical things. So here's what this family said about this picture.
What is that guy doing?
We make it fun.
Do boys put makeup on?
No.
No, but can they?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we put makeup on Sam and Daddy?
Yeah.
Yeah, boys can wear makeup.
So this is a great example because she uses a lot of generic language. Do boys wear makeup? Can they? Boys wear makeup too, that sort of thing. But she ends up using the generic to express counter-stereotypical content. So one of the questions we're asking here, which I'll simplify a bit for time, is what matters more, the content of what parents say, that she ends up endorsing something counter-stereotypic, or the form she uses to say it. So we later measure children's essentialist beliefs about gender. I'm going to skip that measure in the interest of time. But what we found overall in this study is that parents who produce more generic references to gender when they're talking about those people with their children have children who have more essentialist views of gender, meaning in this case that they think gender stereotypic features like liking trucks more than dolls are things that are inborn rather than acquired. If we actually look at the content of what parents say, so how much they actually affirmed stereotypes, we don't find any relationship with children's gender essentialism. So this is consistent with the view that the linguistic form of the generic can send a powerful signal to children, sometimes mattering more than the content of what parents say. So I hope I've given you a sense here for how some of the powerful social cognitive capacities for teaching and learning that Mike's work has revealed sometimes operate in important but also problematic ways to lead to the spread of biased representations of the social world. I think this perspective can help us understand how our words might sometimes influence children's beliefs in ways that we don't anticipate or intend. And in that way might be informative as we think about efforts for social change. I want to thank you. I want to thank Jan for organizing this symposium and asking me to be part of it. I want to thank the Cognitive Science Society for making the wonderful choice to honor Mike in this way. And I thank you all for your attention, and I'd be glad to take your questions.
All right, so we have a couple minutes for questions. I have one in the virtual chat, and so I'll read that one first and then bump to an in-person question. So this question is, what was the language and cultural context of these studies, and to what extent might discourses about kinds generics vary cross-culturally?
Thank you for that question. The data that I showed you today were all from the United States, which I should have specified, so thank you for the opportunity to clarify that. All of them, yes, all of them were implemented on a virtual platform for developmental research. So they included kids from different populations across the country within the United States. And that actually opens up the possibility to examine a bunch of other things that we're looking at about how variation in children's lives, at least within the context of the United States, in some ways that this moderates, how much children are growing up in a more conservative, more gender stratified environment to begin with, sometimes moderates the extent to which language matters in the development of children's essentialist beliefs about gender and gender stereotypes. So I think context absolutely matters, and that's a really important question. There is a lot of linguistics work and work in philosophy looking at generics cross-culturally, and there is some way of expressing a generic reference to categories in every language that has been studied to date. So the idea that there is kind of an abstract kind that you might want to refer to with language seems to be very prevalent across diverse culture and linguistic contexts. Whether the generic leads to essentialism in the same way across different cultural and linguistic contexts is not something that there is too much research on, although there is some, which is convergent, in general, is what I showed you today. But I think that that is something that absolutely needs more investigation. It's so awkward to answer questions when you can't see the person asking and you don't know you are making sense.
So maybe we'll do one in-person question while Tamar comes and sets up. And I know there's another question online, but I'll just send that to you offline, Marjorie, and you can take care. All right.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering, with respect to the first part, if the social context is at all important. if instead of zarbies you would have triangles, and instead of afraid of I don't know, social related context, it will be a shape or a color, would you have the same results?
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, I think that there has to be some background knowledge that these kinds can be distinct in meaningful ways. So I'm not sure just the language could create all that from scratch. Here we tell them there's two groups of people, we give them distinct labels, Zarpies and Gorps. And so children already have, you know, some abstract framework for thinking there's some different kinds of people in the world that are going to have different features. And so they just sort of have to fit what we're telling them into that framework. So it's not like the language is creating it all. So that means I don't think it will work in every, you know, possible situation just from the language itself. But I certainly think it would operate in non-social contexts, you know, if they do have that expectation, like about animal kinds or something like that. So, you know, I think the context does matter. And you have to sort of think it through in each case, if the child has bringing the relevant conceptual framework to fit it in, for the language to fit in that way. Thank you. Okay, I will stop my share and pass it over to Tamar.
Okay, congratulations again. I'm going to gush for a minute because I have time. I actually timed it so I can. Science is an enterprise of cultural learning, like many other human institutions, and it's not possible to get very far or very deep without mentors to guide and teach you and critique your work and inspire you to keep going, especially when you're struggling with a problem you can't solve. And I was fortunate to have many mentors in my journey, and originally Mike was not one of them. But in 2000, in a seminar on cognitive and language development, Alison Gopnik and Dan Slobin gave us a little silver book to read. And the idea in the book was that distinctively human cognition resulted not from language, but from theory of mind. Of course, later Mike would revise and replace this idea based on evidence against it from his own work. But no matter that, at the time, the simplicity and the elegance of the argument really captivated me. And though he didn't know it yet, that was the moment that Mike became one of my mentors from afar, inspiring me to think more broadly about development and evolution and to view the social capabilities of children and the social environments that they inhabit as central to their cognitive development. So I can't possibly present all of the studies I've done that are directly inspired by the work of Mike and his students and collaborators. But now that I have the incredible fortune of being at Duke, there's not a moment that I don't pinch myself to check if I'm dreaming. And I realize that, of course, I'm a little older than all of you, and I'm supposed to know what I'm doing, but I'm still happily learning from Mike as his colleague and as his collaborator, and peppering him with questions which he kindly and patiently answers. A good thing he knows how to interrupt me, and benefiting from his generosity and his inspiration. So thank you very much, Mike, and thank you all for being here to listen today, and wherever else you are in the stratosphere. Okay, actions are a window into minds. Basic principles like people do what they want to do allow us to reverse engineer mental states from observing other people's actions, especially from actions that seem like true, intentional decisions. Even infants and young children do this under conditions in which they perceive actions to be occurring by choice rather than by chance, such as when actions are free and unconstrained, or when someone displays some effort and willingness to persist towards a goal. In his body of work, Mike Tomasello discusses how the capacity to reason about individual agents is an important step in the development of collective intentionality, the cognitive capacity to be, in his words, group-minded and to participate in culture. Taking perspectives of other I's allows children to engage in joint attention with them towards shared goals, and by age 3, appreciate the objectivity of the collective we, that it applies beyond dyads, also to larger groups. Here, I'm going to take up the question of whether, in addition to engaging in and regulating themselves towards collective practices such as norms, Young children also understand that individuals, others as well as themselves, can have collective or normative motives, and how this understanding integrates with their understanding of individual agents' personal and subjective mental lives. So in other words, how children navigate the space between I and we. I'm going to start with two examples that just show that children do the same things with normative motives that they do with psychological idiosyncratic ones. So the first is a demonstration that at least by age 3, children do this kind of reverse engineering from one individual's normative, freely chosen action back to their normative intentions. We can see an overlapping collaborator here. This is Marina Proft, who was then Joseph's. Between Jan and I, she'd done a lot of fantastic work on theory of mind. You should check it out. In this study, we introduced 3- and 4-year-old children to a puppet. His name was Bilbo, who was big enough to operate a marble run. 2 levers were on either side, and children saw that pulling both levers sent a marble from the top all the way down to the right-hand side. If you pulled one lever, the marble went down the left-hand side. Children were then randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions, different kinds of norms, as there are in the world. In the conventional norm condition, we taught them that the rule was to pull both levers because you had to actually match the color of the marble to the color of the chute that it was going down, the door that it was going in. And in the moral norm condition, we actually blocked one side. You can see that here. And we said that the marbles belonged to someone, and if they fell down that one lever side, that they would go missing, and she would be very sad. And then the puppet acted 3 times in a counterbalanced order for each child. One time they did the thing right. They pulled both levers. But 2 other times they did it wrong. And the difference was, in one case, they did it wrong and were able to do otherwise, could have done otherwise. And in the other case, their hands, Bilbo's hands were tied together so that he was physically constrained, so he couldn't have done anything else. So this is the kind of counterfactual inference that Jan was talking about as well in his first talk. We then measured children's rates of protest across the 3 conditions. And across both types of norms, children protested free norm violations at significantly higher rates than constrained ones, indicating that they objected to what they inferred to be the agent's intention to violate the norm, rather than merely objecting to the resulting outcome. In a more recent study, we looked at whether evidence from the choices of one agent to act based on norms allows children to reverse engineer the choices of other agents, ones they haven't seen before. The key manipulation across conditions, in addition to whether the action was perceived as intentional, is whether the action was framed as normative or idiosyncratic. So across 3 conditions, children were told that the action was a preference, what the puppet likes. In another condition, it was a rule, how to play the game, and another condition, it was a function, how the toy works. So the final 2 conditions are more objective, normative, or facts about the world, and the first one is an idiosyncratic fact about the person. From the context, we looked to see if children could distinguish learning something unique about a person to learning something about people in general. So other than that, the actions were the same across conditions. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about sampling as a way of indicating intent, but you can ask me about it at the end. There's no sound, but the thing is making a little sound. There's no sound. So you can see he's just selecting, the puppet is only selecting one kind of thing, the circles, and he's leaving the flowers, the alternative kind of thing, on the table. And you can also see that there's fewer circles than flowers. That's the intentional part. Okay. Oops. Okay. So first 3 bars, these 3 bars show that across all conditions, rates of learning the first agent's preference or learning the rule or learning the function were the same. So the yellow bars is when you give children a choice of 3 objects, the one that he picked, the alternative, and something else that they hadn't seen before, something novel, they give it back the one that he picked. So that was the one he liked, that was the one that was part of the Blicket game, and then that was the one that makes the machine go. And then next we measured which of 3 objects children gave to a new agent. This new agent was monkey, and we did this keeping the generalization prompt as neutral as possible. Can you give monkey one that he likes, one that is part of the game, or one that makes the toy go? Again, the same 3 choices. And rates of choosing the target object to give to the new agent, to monkey, were significantly lower than chance for preferences. So they didn't learn monkey's preferences from the other guy's preferences, but significantly above chance for both rules and for functions. Okay, so those are the two examples of how preschool children reverse engineer normative intentions, both of one individual and also of groups, from freely chosen and normatively framed actions. But so for me, the more interesting question, so I'll spend a little more time on this, that Mike's work raises, is how collective intentionality integrates with children's belief desire psychology. By what causal model do children think norms influence actions? So I'll give you two possibilities to consider. And they're, I think, not the only ones, but I'll try to provide at least some empirical evidence that maybe distinguishes between them. The first possibility is that we, or young children, hold a model in which collective intentions exert influence on psychological states, such as what one believes or knows or desires to do, and that those resulting beliefs and desires determine action. So under this possibility, we can preserve the basic tenets of our belief-desire psychology, and the influence of norms is indirect. But there's a second possibility, which is that norms, we think, or children think, that norms act as a direct causal force on actions, that collective intentions essentially become what we believe, what we know, and want to do. Under this latter model, normative motives live alongside psychological ones, and the relationship is one of sort of trading off between them. Sorry, I forgot Tess Flanagan, who ran that last study. I'm going to show you their pictures again at the end. This is Nadia Cherniak, who did this work in my lab. She's now at Irvine. And as a first piece of evidence for this latter model. So in her work, we showed across several studies that preschool children believe that an obligation, how one ought to act, constrains how one can act, and also how one will act, even in the face of explicitly conflicting desires. So we've done this using vignettes such as these, in which children are told stories about a character who has a desire to violate a norm. So here's Johnny, and he's always nice to his friends, and he wants to do something different. He wants to hit his friends. Can he just do that, and will he do that, are the questions. We've also done this, turning this in on kids and their own actions, but I'm not going to talk about that data here. This graph shows the breakdown of children's responses to this kind of can question, action possibility, by age and by social domain, so across moral and conventional types of domains. These are children in a middle-class US sample who pass standard batteries of theory of mind tasks, and they know that desires cause actions. But they also believe that obligations will determine actions when desires conflict with them. And the younger children believe this much more strongly than the older ones. So this pattern also holds for the action prediction question, what will he do? So what can he do and what will he do? Younger children think are more likely to say that even if he wants to do something that violates a norm, he's going to do something that follows it. And then that changes with age. In cultures where norms are more strictly enforced, such as the two cultural communities that we study in Singapore, this belief predominates all the way through middle childhood. So you see the same age-related change, but on the y-axis here, this is the can he act on his desires, so high means yes and low means no, and what you see is the kids in Singapore are saying absolutely not. He's got to do what he ought to do. Okay, so you might worry already in this first example that I showed, it's specifically about desires that violate norms. So, of course, children think that if there's a norm and a desire and there's a direct conflict between them, the norm wins. Also, I showed you two models, and that data doesn't really distinguish between them. It's consistent both with an indirect and a direct causal influence. So norms might influence actions indirectly by constraining the possible desires that you can have. So you simply can't have a desire that violates a norm. Or more directly, by winning over your other desires to determine what you do. So I'm not quite gotten. Here's another stronger piece of evidence for that latter model. And this one involves a norm that doesn't actually require you to give up a personal desire in order to do something pro-social or normative at all. This norm in social psychology is called social mindfulness. It's one in which if you don't know someone's preference, you should leave them choices. So even if you take something you like for yourself, make sure that the next person who needs to take something, if you've got someone behind you, let's say in line, has something to choose from. So we showed 4-, 5-, and 6-year-old children and adults, and this is Alice Zhao, who is now at East China Normal University, a story in which 2 agents act on a desire, and their desire just to have an apple for snack, while someone is waiting behind them in line. One of these guys, this one right here, is socially mindful, leaving options for the person waiting behind, and one of them is not. 6-year-old children in both the US and in China make social evaluations that the character who followed the norm was nicer than the one who wasn't. And they do it at the same high rates as adults. So this is a norm that by age 6, children have. I realize these kids are a little bit older. Some norms take longer to learn and even to act on. But the more important thing is that 6-year-olds' judgments depended on the context of the action. So there has to be someone waiting in line. The action isn't nicer if there's no one waiting behind you. It doesn't really matter what you take. And they also depend on the agent's intent. There has to be a choice of not leaving options. Otherwise, there can be no signal of a normative or a pro-social intent. So here, this person right here picks an orange and leaves a choice. But no matter what she would have done, she would have left a choice. So children at age 6, the same age children, don't rate this person as having pro-social intent, as being nicer. Okay, so together, these first 2 examples suggest that children across cultures hold at least 2 beliefs about the causal relationships between norms, desires, and actions. Norms can constrain desires, and norms can coexist with them. As a stronger test of the influence of norms on actions, we then asked if children believe that norms can be independent of desires entirely. So you do something you ought to do without having any desire to do it whatsoever. In this study, Alice Zhao and I asked 4- to 8-year-old children to make comparative social judgments about 2 story characters. The stimuli, this was a bit of a replication with some changes to a study that Christina Starmans and Paul Bloom did in 2016. So we used their South Park little characters here. One of these guys acted pro-socially, helping her brother retrieve a lost ball, or normatively, following a rule. This was just one of the cases that we had, while having a conflicting desire to do something else. So in this case, she really wanted to play outside. Her brother needed help. She helped her brother. There was another character that they were told about who also did the same exact normative action, but had no alternative desire. So that person didn't want to do anything else, and they helped their brother. So we followed social judgment questions, both which one of these people is nicer and also which one of these people should get the prize, which was the replication part of the previous study, with ratings about how much each character wanted to help. So in other words, how much did the character have a moral or a normative desire in addition to their other one in that case? And then we looked at social judgments, moral desire ratings, and the relationship between the 2. So that's, the questions. Who gets the prize? Who's nicer? And then how much does this guy want to help? Not very much, a little or a lot. And how much does this other guy want to help? Not much, a little or a lot. So the first result was a developmental change in children's social evaluations. Younger children thought that the character who didn't have a self-interested desire to play was more virtuous and nicer. 8-year-olds and adults, on the other hand, believe that there's virtue in giving up something that you want to help, so they rated the character who gave something up as nicer. I can talk more about this result if you're interested, but I think it's consistent with the developmental changes I showed earlier in how young children believe obligations sort of ought to constrain actions, and then that changes with age. So these are kids in the US. The critical question is whether children think moral desires are necessary for moral actions, and the answer was absolutely not. Children rated the moral desires of the character who didn't want to play outside as really high, that's this right here, and the desires of the character who did want to play outside as really low. And in addition, there was no correlation between saying he was a really nice guy or should get the prize and how much he wanted to do it. So both 8-year-olds and adults thought the character who gave up their own desire to help did so despite not wanting to. So these 3 examples together suggest that young children across cultures have a model in which norms exert a direct causal influence on action. And the last example in particular shows that reasoning about collective intentions doesn't require positing subjective intentions that align with them. So in some cultures, people do posit subjective intentions in alignment with collective ones, but that actually can vary across cultures, and children can still have this model to start out with. Maybe one of my take-home messages from trying to work at the interface of social and developmental psychology is just because it happens in adults doesn't mean that's how it starts. More generally, these results suggest that from age 3 or 4, children have a complex model of mental states that considers collective beliefs and collective motives alongside and possibly interacting with idiosyncratic or personal ones. And how they relate, how they change with age, and how they vary across cultural communities are all open questions for future research. These are my lead authors here, Marina Proft, Tess Flanagan, Nadia Cherniak, and Al Zhao, and my other collaborators on these projects, my lab and funding agencies, and thank you, Mike, and everyone for listening. Did I go too long? Oh. I can take.
Yeah, I'll just let you know if there's any online.
No one has an audience question on that.
Hi, that was great. Thank you, that was really wonderful. So could you say a little more about cultural variation in the degree to which own desires are felt to line up with collective norms?
So that's a received wisdom from the cultural psychologists, is that one of the ways to think about cultures which think more about norms as the sort of predominant cause of action is that what they do, what children develop over time is an internalization of those norms as their own desires. And that certainly could possibly be the case. One thing so I guess I think a lot more about the idiosyncrasies of Western culture, which is that we seem to think that I think that what happens to children, initially I think all these kids, but age 3 or 4, that sort of, no matter what they think about belief, desire, psychology, norms are direct causes of action. And in fact, even adults act like this all the time. Well, you don't say, I wanted to help. You say, I helped because because helping. Like, you don't need another explanation. And of course, people's explanations are not necessarily their causal models, so there's a little problematic in my argument there. But one of the things that seems to happen with us over time, why we get developmental changes that don't happen in Singapore or in Nepal or in Peru and other cultures that we've looked at, is because we think that acting on desires is a norm. I think there's a difference between the way little kids think about desires and the way adults in our culture think about desires. And just because we use the same word doesn't mean we're talking about the same causal model. We have a lot of messaging in our culture about, doing the things you want, living your dream, your best life, all this kind of stuff. So individualism is a kind of a norm, I think, in our culture. When we look at children's beliefs about controlling their desires, we see pretty similar across cultures. Children around age 6 believe that desires are something that can come under your control. So you can act against them if you need to. That doesn't differ. But if we measure self-control tasks, so this is another study by Alice Zhao, we measure their self-control and we look at correlations between their beliefs about self-control and their actual ability for self-control. The correlations between beliefs about I can inhibit my desires and the actual ability to do that only in Western cultures. Because that's our causal model of what it means to have free will. It means I should be able to do what I want, and I should be able to not do what I want. So everything becomes, so desires sort of predominate by age 6 as an explanation. There's a lot of stuff there, but I'm happy to talk more about it. Yeah, did you have any others?
No online questions, we move to
All right. Oh, one more? Can I take one more?
Sure, yeah. Oops, sorry. Yeah, actually, is a follow-up question to that because you had the figure. Sorry, you just. Yeah.
Do you want a figure?
Well, you had the figure where you had the U.S. children population on the left-hand side and an international population on the right-hand side, and we focused on the 6-year-olds and the adults being very similar. But I did notice that the younger children and the U.S. population seem to have kind of like a stepwise. Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
so
yeah.
your 4-year-olds and your 5-year-olds in the U.S. population looks different than the 4-year-olds and the 5-year-olds in the China population, the difference between those two.
So that's from one experiment. There's multiple experiments in this paper, so I'm not sure that that particular stepwise thing replicated across experiments.
Okay.
We could what we got across experiments consistently was a change between 5 and 6.
Gotcha.
And that the 6-year-olds did it in all cases. They understood the norm when it didn't necessarily depend on the counterfactual. They understood it when it did depend on the counterfactual. They understood that it required another person to be there behind. And also, the one thing that we did get difference between the two cultural groups is that the kids in China were much more articulate about the norm. So if you look at their explanations, the kids in the US, they know that it's better, and the kids in China can explain why, leaving other people choices. This is the kind of thing where you go into it not expecting, but kids in China aren't supposed to care as much about choice as kids here, but they care about it, and they especially care about it if it's a norm.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
yeah. All right, thank you. Oh, yeah. So my collaborator on that study, Gweon, is our last speaker.
Okay, can people hear me okay? Hopefully all's good. Great. Yep, I'm seeing yes. Okay, great. Oops, sorry about that. Sorry, I think my PowerPoint quit, so let me just start again and then share my screen again. Okay, hopefully this all works well. Okay, great. So it's a true pleasure and a privilege to be a part of this symposium here in honor of Mike Tomasello. I'm really sad that I can't really be there with all of you in person, but on the other hand, it's kind of fitting that I'm currently in Göttingen in Germany, just a couple of hours from Leipzig, where Mike has spent nearly 2 decades of his unbelievably productive research career. And it's lovely to be visiting this university surrounded by so much history. So I kind of feel obligated to start the talk with an old folk tale. So here it goes. Once upon a time, there was an emperor who spent lavishly on fancy clothes. And one day he met a tailor who said, "Oh, I hear you have very good taste in fashion. So allow me to make a magnificent robe just for you, made of special fabric that is invisible to people who are stupid and incompetent." And the emperor said, "That sounds great. I look forward to seeing it." And then a few weeks later, the tailor comes back with a finished robe, like here, with a proud smile on his face. And he says, "Look, isn't this just marvelous?" And the emperor says, "Oh, beautiful. Well done, tailor. Hey, everyone, get prepared for a royal parade so I can show this new robe to everyone in town." So the story ends with a parade, kind of a sad parade where the not so stupid emperor walks proudly in his undergarment, and all the villagers, also not so stupid, taking turns to compliment on his new beautiful robe, until a young child blurts out, "Look, the emperor is wearing nothing." So what does the story tell us? So many of you may have heard this story as a child, and I did too. And even as an adult, actually, it was quite fascinating to read through many scholarly commentaries on the meaning of the story. So for instance, this story can be read as a metaphor for human pretentiousness, pomposity, hypocrisy, hollow ostentatiousness, and even collective denial, which actually sounds like a laundry list of everything that's wrong with our society that rings even true to today. So, but also interestingly, this story seems to suggest a rather romanticized notion of childhood innocence that shields children from worrying about what other people think of them. So as cognitive scientists, we see a question here that can be studied using empirical methods. What makes us, adults at least, capable of worrying about our reputation and present ourselves as smart or competent, virtuous, or you name it? And so what are the cognitive mechanisms that support such kind of reasoning, and how does it develop in early childhood? So as presented so clearly last night in his talk and in Mike's papers, as well as books, including some of the recent ones, Mike's work has been guided by this broader goal of understanding what really makes who we are. And he tries to identify and describe and explain the similarities and differences between humans and non-human species, with a focus on the ontogeny of the individual and its psychology, but also in the context of the species evolutionary history, like he emphasized just last night. So his work really touches upon some of the most quintessentially human behaviors, like helping and communicating, collaborating, but also negotiating, bargaining, punishing, blaming, or betraying, apologizing, and reason giving and forgiving too. And perhaps one of the major consequences of becoming human, that is being aware of, and he tries to explain that in terms of the combination of the uniquely human motivational and cognitive processes guided by individual experiences. And perhaps one of the major consequences of becoming human, that is being aware of the self as agents and us as agents and appreciating their perspectives, is that we become socially self-aware agents that are able to care about one's impression on others and even actively monitor and change and manage such impressions. And this not only reflects the sophistication of human cognition, it's also what makes us worried about appearing stupid and pretend as if we can see the rope here. So, of course, Mike's own work, as well as Jan's and many others in the field, have done pioneering work in this direction. And following the footsteps, what I'm going to do is to try to highlight some of our own recent work that begins to ask these two basic questions. First, do children worry and care about what others think of them? And do children monitor and maintain or manage these representations? So let's go to the first. Do children care about what others think? So to get to this question, we use a modified version of a delay of gratification task as a measure of children's curiosity about what others think of them. And the question is, do they care more about what an adult thinks of them as opposed to what an adult thinks about a peer, like another child? So this work is led by Peter Zhu, first-year student in the lab. And what he does is to ask the child to draw either a tree or a bird. And this particular child chose to draw a tree. And when she's done, Peter puts it in a folder, like this yellow folder here. And then he shows that another child named Jordan, gender matched to the child, drew the other thing, in this case, a bird. And he also puts Jordan's drawing inside this green folder over here. And of course, the color of the folder is counterbalanced across participants. And then Peter tells the child, I'm going to take a real good look at these drawings and put a star sticker on it if I think it's good. I'm going to take a look at yours and put a star sticker if I think it's good, and not a star sticker if I think it's not good. I'm going to do the same with the Jordans. I'm going to put a star sticker if I think it's good, and not if I think it's not good. And then he goes to the back of the room with the folders, spends some time pretending to take a real good look at it. And then he comes back with both folders. But just as he comes back to the table to take a look at this together, Peter gets a phone call and tells the kid that he has to step out, but he's going to be back in a little bit to look at it together. And importantly, he leaves the child alone with one of two folders, either the one that has the child's own drawing or the other kid's drawing inside. So let's take a look at what the child does. And in this case, the child was left with the folder that contains her own drawing.
Right here, but I'll be right back, okay? Yeah.
So she checks to see if Peter's gone. Takes a good look. And then she waits quite patiently. But then she takes another look, because why not? It's always easier the second time. So I can't really resist showing what happens when Peter actually returns. So he sits down to open the folder for the child, and let's take a look at what happens.
A star sticker? Yeah. Okay, let's take a look. Look! I gave you a star sticker.
So she looks as if she's surprised and delighted to see a sticker in the folder, even though she knew the entire time. So I must warn you that these are very, very preliminary results. But for now, just keep in mind that children in the study really had no pressing need to peek, because the sticker is already in there or not. The fate of the drawing is determined, and he promised to return to take a look at it together. So if anything, peeking would break the implied expectation that they should be waiting until he returns. So the question is, do children peek more often when the folder contains their own drawing as opposed to another child's drawing? And at least the answer seems to be tentatively yes. Again, very much aware of the fact that this is just small n's, but at least it seems that children do care about what others think of them more than what others think of somebody else. And of course, what I admire about Mike's research is that he doesn't stop at demonstrating an interesting phenomenon. They're always in the service of understanding the capacities that give rise to these behaviors. And these results also raise further questions about the nature of these representations and how they might influence downstream behaviors, like being able to actively communicate to manage those representations. So that's exactly what the second study is going to be about. Can children infer and revise what other people think of them? So this work has been led by Mika Asaba, a former PhD student in the lab and now a postdoc at Yale. And this paper is actually just about to be out next week. So what she does in this study is to sit in front of a child and show two different toys, red and green here. And then what she says is, we're going to play with these toys and Anne is going to watch us play. And Anne, another person, she walks into the room and sits right next to Mika. And then what she says is, oh, wow, these are cool toys. I don't know anything about them. So she claims her ignorance about both of these toys. Now let's take a look at what happens in the study.
1, 2, 3, go.
So Mika activates. So they first play with the red toy. And Mika activates the second toy.
Oh, that's really cool. That toy makes music.
And Anne acknowledges her success.
1, 2, 3, go.
The child fails.
Okay, let me try again. Okay. 1, 2, 3, go.
Okay, see you later. Have fun at that lunar Chinese. Where's the green one?
For the green one.
Oh, that's really cool. It makes music.
Okay, now you can try, Ethan.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, so you know what, Ethan?
What?
You have to push this button and this button at the exact same time. Okay?
Oh yeah, I forgot.
Cool. Well, I have to run.
Okay, bye.
See you later.
So Anne leaves the room.
Do you want to try again?
Yeah.
Okay.
One last time.
1, 2, 3. Oh, there you go.
Oh, there. Finally.
See, the child is very happy.
Cool.
So what you just have seen is what we call the absent condition and the observed toy phase, where the child fails twice and then finally succeeds for a third time, but Anne leaves just before the child's success. And what happens afterwards is they play, so Anne leaves the room thinking that the child cannot make the red toy go. What happens afterwards is children get to play with the unobserved toy, the green one, the other one. The same thing happens. The child fails twice and then finally succeeds. The experience of the child is matched across the two toys, but this all happens while Anne is still waiting outside. And then we bring out the both toys back and make sure that child can successfully activate both. And then ask the final test question. Now, Anne's going to come back in the room. Which toy do you want to show Anne? Now, in the other condition that we call the present condition, everything was exactly the same except for the timing of the Anne's departure. So she leaves the room after the child's success on the observed toy, leaving the room thinking that the child can activate the red toy go. Now, so I want to emphasize that in both conditions, children had very good reasons to show the green toy, the unobserved toy, to Anne because she doesn't know how it works, nor has she seen the child interact with it. And of course, that's exactly what children do in the present condition. Children were more likely to choose the green toy over the red toy when Anne had already seen them succeed on the observed toy. However, in the absent condition, when Anne left just before the child's success, children were more likely to show the red toy compared to the green toy. And in a larger set of replication with just 3- and 4-year-olds, we see exactly the same pattern. Now you might think, hey, that's kind of cool, but is it possible that children in the absent condition are just confused and they just chose randomly, which is a totally fair point. But our hypothesis here was that children might have two competing goals. They want to show the observed toy to teach Anne how it works because she doesn't know, but they also want to show off that they can activate the observed toy as well, and that should be present only in the absent condition. And if the chance level choice is due to children being torn between these two goals, then if we remove the goal to teach by making Anne knowledgeable about both of these toys in the beginning, then now we should see an above chance performance for the observed toy in the absent condition. And that's actually, and I also want to emphasize that this is a non-trivial. Oh, sorry, something's happening in my computer. Oh, where'd it go? I want to emphasize that this is a non-trivial task because what children could do, children could have easily shown either one of the two toys to present their success, and that's still something positive. However, in order to selectively choose the red toy over the green toy in this condition, children really had to understand that Anne might have some ideas about how they did on that specific red toy. And that's exactly what we see in this condition. Children are more likely to choose the red toy over the green toy in this study. And another replication, despite somewhat smaller effects, what we have found is that children, there may be some developmental change in that children who are older were more likely to show this effect. So what does this tell us about how humans reason about others' representations of us? In many ways, it's similar to how we reason about others' representations of the external world, such as where Sally thinks her ball is. It's either in the box or in the basket, and Anne, just like how Anne might think the child can or cannot make the toy go. And we care about their truthfulness, just like how we might want to tell Sally that her ball is in the basket or teach how the toy works. We also want to communicate something about ourselves and revise outdated representations, just like how the child did. What's interesting, though, is that we also care tremendously about the valence of that something. We want it to be good. We want it to be positive and virtuous. So the child you just saw may have been particularly motivated to show off because it's not only true that he can make the toy go, but it's also positive. So if you think about the emperor or the villagers, they were in fact withholding information that could reveal the fact that they are incompetent. So the question is, our desire to revise outdated representations might depend on the valence of that representation. And that's what our studies are trying to get at, whether self-relevant representations may influence children's behaviors. So in this study, what we did was to ask a child to draw a tree like this one over here, and we placed it on top of a pile. And then what Anne did was to walk into the room and picked up the drawing that was supposed to be what the child saw. And she said, "Oh, thanks for showing me," to acknowledge that she saw the drawing. But actually what she really saw was better or worse than the child's own drawing. So the final question was, what do you want to do when Anne comes back? Either play a new activity, or do you want to make another drawing? Again, if children care only about the truthfulness, they should be choosing drawing in both cases because that's going to reveal their true ability. However, children in the study were more likely to choose the drawing when Anne saw a drawing that was much worse than their own. And again, I want to emphasize that children in this context chose this, not necessarily because they're always blindly trying to improve their reputation. It's only because we created a context where it might make sense to do so. So for instance, in other contexts where it really matters for Anne to know the truth, then they might have acted differently. So what do these studies show? It shows us that we care a lot about what others think of us, just like this child over here. We may care about different kinds of qualities and virtues, like the ones that you see here, and you name it. However, the thing is that we do care. Another thing is that we're also smart enough to reason about this kind of stuff. We are able to represent what we ourselves, as well as others, know and think about ourselves, as well as other people. And we behave in ways that can revise and improve those representations. And of course, if what I think about me and what others think about me are aligned together in a positive way, that's really great. However, problems can arise when our own and others are misaligned. And in fact, you can think about how this might connect to many things like imposter syndrome or narcissism, or the reasons why underlying causes for depression. So why do we as scientists care? It's one of those quintessentially, it's a behavior that is coming from quintessentially human motivations that are manifest in specific forms. It's one of those cases where cognition can give rise to a diverse array of self-relevant concerns. And it's also a prime example of how humans might use theory of mind, not just about the external world, but also about the self. However, most prior work has much more focused on the former, for instance, Sally and Task here. But do I really care about what Sally thinks where her ball is? Actually, I'm much more curious about what Sally thinks of me. So from that point of view, Mike's work continues to, and at the end of the day, just like what Mike said, and as Jan has emphasized, cognition serves the way we behave and shapes our everyday lives. And all this is to say, Mike's work has and continues to inspire us to study reputational reasoning as a window into uniquely human cognition. And there's a lot of work in this domain, along with by others as well as our own. And also it's related to some of the work that's presented today by Marjorie earlier. So now, what's up with this kid who blurted out that the emperor is wearing nothing? Well, if I could write my own commentary about what the story tells us, and I hope many of you might agree too, is that maybe, perhaps, the child wasn't saying this because he was too naive or unable to think about what others think of them. Maybe he was trying to convey that he is courageous enough to see through his pretentiousness and able to communicate that openly. So with all that, I thank my lab and former and current lab members, especially Mika Saba, Peter Zhu, and Aaron Chui, and also congratulations to Mike for this well-deserved award.
All right, so we have a couple minutes for questions. There is one from our virtual attendee, so I'll read that first. So this person says, thank you. In the tree picture study, it seemed to be around 50-50 whether they choose drawing or blocks when the drawing shown was worse. Which activity do children choose if Anne saw the child's actual drawing to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me see if I can pull up this slide again. Well, I'll just say you're totally right that it was around 50-50. And I have to say that it's an interesting question about what a control condition might look like. That's one of many control conditions that we had considered in that study. However, note that children already had played with drawing before. So there was already a pretty high chance that children might be wanting to play with the blocks. So I think children's baseline preference for either activity might depend on what they had already played with, as well as many other factors. Now, if children had seen the child's actual drawing to begin with, it would be a great condition to run if we really wanted to show whether children are trying to revise the deflated representations of them, or whether they're trying to maintain or others inflated representations of them, because that difference can tell us a little bit about exactly what the underlying motivation is. However, because we hadn't run that control condition, what we're able to say is that we do see a difference between these two conditions. And I think there's many ways in which the results of the study could play out. So it's one of those things that we are very much looking forward to studying further along these lines. So thanks for asking that question.
All right, we have time for one more question. So Roger in the room, go ahead.
Thank you for the really elegant and wonderful talk and work. What do children understand about other people's reputations and when?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think some of the studies that's done in the past, so a lot of the studies that I understand that's in the field currently has looked at what the child thinks of their own reputation. But if you put it into a third-party context, then we can start asking how children think about other people's reputations and how they might apply this kind of reasoning in order to predict how other people might behave in a certain context and predict their behaviors as well as explain their behaviors. I can't really say exactly how the developmental trajectory might go. It either could emerge at the same time as children are able to do this kind of thing in a first-person context, or it might be the case that it really does require some additional representations about what kind of consequences the other person might be worried about. So I think it depends a lot in exactly what the study procedure might look like. However, again, I think the idea of reputation is really at the core about what people think about other people and how that might relate to the downstream consequences of how other people might be treating me or treating other people. So I think a lot of the processes that Mike has told us last night is really relevant to giving rise to a lot of these representations as well as behaviors. So what I'm hoping is that this line of work and what he has been trying to tell us, the importance of cognitive representations in the service of everyday real world behaviors. I'm hoping that we will continue to see a lot of new work in this line of inquiries. So thanks for asking that question.
All right, thanks to all our speakers at the symposium. And we have about a 10-minute break before our last keynote talk. Thank you.
I'm not sure if others can hear us, but it was really great to see all of you.
Yes, great to see you. Great talks, everybody.
Yeah, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining. Hope to see you soon in person.
Yes. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.